as I was looking over all of the things I could say, the quote attributed to Mark Twain popped in my mind for him of like, he didn't have time to write somebody a short letter, so he wrote them a long letter.
Right.
And I feel I'm not quite smart enough to give you guys a short overview, and we don't have time for the long one. So I'm going to sort of do my best to do a very broad brush sort of caricature of the general argument. And I'm going to ask you and our listeners, just like listen with, like, allow yourself to be open to curiosity if like two things don't quite line up, because they may not line up perfectly. This is like a caricature. Like if I were to get a Sharpie at a farmer's market and do a caricature of you, I would highlight some features to make it recognizable, but it'd be very different than a lithograph, an engraving, or some like very specific painting. So this is the caricature of the argument meant to outline the main contours. So as you mentioned, Keith, the common mistake is people will hear an opinion, or they will ask somebody about an action, like what's your sense here, or do you support X, Y, or Z, or who are you voting for, or any number of these sort of things. And when they hear that, they will apply a level of development as the source and the explanation in their mind, like, oh, this is why you did this. Equally wrong is they will know somebody well, and they will have a good sense of their level of development, and they will believe they can predict the answer to a question, like, oh, you're really highly developed. I know who you're going to vote for. I know how you must feel about this because of the causal relationship there. And that's what I'm going to say is completely fallacious. And I want to spend a few minutes here just sort of unpacking a visual framework to help us better appreciate this.
Okay.
Can I go ahead and do that?
No, go for it.
So assuming, we're staying with the inside baseball thing or the inside integral here, we have the standard levels of development. We have, we're going to stick with the color codes here. I often will bring in Robert Keegan's language of order. So we have red, just like the selfish order, the second order. We have the blue, amber. I'm old school. I prefer blue versus amber. So we have that sort of socialized mind, third order, the self-authoring orange, modern mindset, as well as green, which is the postmodern. And then we can get into the second tier of yellow, teal, turquoise. I'm not familiar with those colors nor with those experiences, so I'll stop there. So we have this developmental hierarchy, and there's two quick points I want to make about this. One of which is this way of appreciating the sequential unfolding of human adult development is an abstract observation of collecting a lot of data points. So if you were to give out a lot of developmental assessments, and we're going to skip the how you determine what's valid or not, you're going to see people will tend to aggregate around these sort of clusters, and these clusters can be they cluster based on how people understand the world, the degree of complexity. But it's not like they are distinct floors, like you can have to get off the elevator on the second floor or the third. The sort of like aggregated clusters breaking out of the
Let me interrupt you just for clarification.
For
so in other words, what I hear you saying, just to confirm, is that they're orange. It's someone that's orange or 4.0 or 3.5 in Terry Fallon's model. What you're saying is it's sort of like their center of gravity is there, but it's sort of a messy aggregate, that they're almost like there's no there in some ways, that it's they're oriented around that center of gravity, but they're going to be below and above, and they might be different in a relationship with their intimate partner or their boss than they are when they take the test, et cetera, et cetera. Is that what you mean?
Well, that's true for individuals, which is the point I was going to make.
Okay.
So for individuals, there's sort of a cloud of probability around one or two of these orders. Usually it's two. There's sort of like an overlap. But with the actual existence of these orders, this is the third order, this is the fourth order, this is the blue stage, this is the red stage, this is the orange stage. These are also abstracted out of aggregates of a population level. So there's populations and individuals. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So that's the vertical axis here. So where there's been some confusion is if you imagine that there's a certain perspective within these levels that is revealed when you're at that level, and this perspective shapes how you understand the world and shapes how you appreciate the world, that's also true. So there's going to be a more complex worldview from a higher perspective, which historically, and this is where things get really cloudy here, this is where a lot of integrals make errors, is that the blue level of development yields the traditional worldview, or the the more religious worldview. The orange level reveals the modern worldview, and the green level reveals the postmodern worldview. And again, this is the very broadest brush approach. And so while there's some truth there, these worldviews, once revealed and then written down and communicated, can then, propagate throughout the culture and exist somewhat independently, at least in written form. And they have the ability to be accessed and participated in to some degree by people from a different or lower level of development, same with higher level development. So what ends up happening in the real world, and this is where I'm going to bring out the horizontal axis, you'll have the traditional worldview, or I call it the traditional value stack. You have the modern worldview, or I call the modern value stack, and then you have the postmodern progressive worldview, or the progressive value stack. So you have these three value stacks laid out across the horizontal axis. Then you have these levels of development up the vertical axis. And now this is where things get really interesting, is that you can look at this. Okay, here's this blue level of development that tends to have these structural components. It views things sort of like in a very right, wrong dynamic. There's a us and them. It's inherently a cultural framework. So it has rules, roles, rituals. There's some belief systems that are baked into that, but there's how you hold that. And you kind of hold it in a sort of rigid way. Where do you access truth? Truth is revealed. Truth is from texts. Truth is from experts. So you can look at that way, that mindset operates within the traditional value stack, and you get this sort of like stereotypical, religious fundamentalist. But then how do you see that in the orange value stack? Well, you have a stereotypical scientific materialist fundamentalist. Or how do you see that in the green value stack, the progressive value stack? And that's where you see the very fundamentalist social justice warrior type, equally absolutely certain, equally aggressive when challenged, equally oriented to there's the right way, the wrong way, equally morally certain. There's a certain sort of similarity in how these structures operate, which is separate from the developmental axis where you were comparing somebody from a modern orange value stack, this middle level of the value stack, versus somebody from a more fundamentalist modern value stack. You're going to see some of the content is the same. They're talking about science, they're talking about truth, but how they hold it is very different. And that's where that structure content fallacy really shows up. I'm going to pause here because I know I've just dumped a lot there. So I know you may have some clarifying to me questions, or where you want to take the conversation next year.
I mean, it's that sounds relatively straightforward.
Right.
I'm holding the visual of the value stacks horizontally in the development, but everything you said makes sense, right? It's like, I've talked a lot about this on this program, and it's been a theme throughout Integral Life. But when we look at the culture wars, it's very seldom is it postmodern, genuinely developmentally postmodern views arguing with genuinely modern views. That's not really what's happening, because those conversations tend to be pretty civilized and reasonable. It tends to be when these value stacks, as you call them, are coming from earlier developmental levels, either amber or umber, or Terry's conformist versus expert phase, but
right.
Some basically fully rational stage of development, which makes authentic debate sort of authentic from the lens of rationality basically impossible.
Right.
So anyway, it sounds like I understand you. It sounds like we're on the same page.
Yeah, and like you mentioned at the beginning, like conceptually, when we're talking about this, it's pretty easy. It's like, this is not complicated. But so you see this, but then you start listening to how people are talking about integral, or how people are talking about the world, and you see a lot of statements or hopes or like ideas that just are completely contrary to what you would then, what the implications that would follow. For example, if you look at how development must unfold and has unfolded, it creates a pyramid of, like, I think Ken even says this, we all start at zero and there's no passing go. There's no way to like leapfrog. And so if you were to look at this pyramid of a population, the majority of people in a population based on age and developmental aptitude are going to be lower. So there's going to be a lot of red, especially in children. There's going to be a lot of blue, which is the majority of any culture, because that's what the culture is. The culture by definition is blue, and this is where we can get into some of the more interesting implications. But that true orange level of developmental attainment, that self-authoring, that individuation stage is extremely rare when you look at what does it mean to understand and operate at that level. Not talk about trusting the science or talking about any of these like modern things that get labeled as orange. Again, it's not the content. It's not saying, oh, I believe in objectivity. It's I believe this. Like, well, how do you hold these beliefs? Do you believe them fundamentally, like a lot of people do? Or do you believe them that you've arrived at these beliefs through your own sort of observations? Even more rare is green or yellow. Like this pyramid gets really tight at the top. So there's some data, and I might get the numbers off a smidge, but Robert Keegan's research into these orders of development had something like 40-something% were at blue, like 40-something% were in orange, 30-something, and then like 6% tops are in green. And this is college-educated U.S. adults. This isn't the ones who didn't go to college. This isn't globally. So hearing certain people talk about like, oh, you know, back in 2015, 28% of the U.S. population was green. It's like, no, that's just, no. I will say no to that unequivocally. And we could talk about, this is the fallacy, 28% might have had a progressive worldview orientation, but they were not at that altitude. And so this is the point you make. If you're trying to have a conversation or discussion with somebody and you hear them talking about progressive values, you may be like, oh, we are past orange. We are past the sovereign individual, which is the bedrock of the orange altitude. We can have this interesting debate about nuance and complexity. And a lot of times you can't have that conversation with somebody who has progressive values because you can't have that conversation at that level with anybody below that level, regardless of the value stack that they are most comfortable with and operating within. It depends on their altitude of development. So this is where, in the messy real world of like, you know, my work with coaching and consulting, most people aren't at green. Most people aren't at orange. Most people are somewhere in this blue-orange shift, or they're working with a team, and most of their team is going to be in blue. So what does effective action in the world look like if this is the reality versus this idea you often hear and some of the sort of rarefied air of like, we just got to get everybody to integral? That's never going to happen. The pyramid's always going to look like this. There is no time when everybody's going to be at integral. There's no time when everybody's going to be at blue, frankly. So let's refocus where and how we're applying our efforts, our energy, our attention, our intention on things that can actually be helpful to the health of the spiral. And that's focusing on the blue-orange band of the developmental framework, especially in our work as integrally informed people trying to show up in ways that make a difference.
I don't know what to do. How am I supposed to run my life? How am I supposed to even make sense of the news?
By virtue of the very fact of wealth inequality and the way in which it distorts a system, it also generates the seeds of its own destruction.
Meta crises are exhausting, multi-generational problems. We cannot afford to just burn out.
All the ways we try to sever the subjective from the objective, all of these things have collapsed.
You might realize that you're framing the problem in a particular way which prevents you from solving the puzzle.
The only way to handle a meta crisis is with a meta framework.
Is there the potential for a wonderful second-tier, spiritually intelligent, Gaia embodying next level of humanity? I hope so.
Do what you can where you are. What are some of the unique gifts that you have?
We can see all of these worldviews as essentially portals into whatever version of sustainability makes the most sense or carries the greatest meaning.